was considered well validated. This plot shows the CRJ's corrected pressure and radio altitudes as solid lines, and the Blackhawk's corrected pressure and radio altitudes as dotted lines for the end of the flight. The Blackhawk was not broadcasting to ADSB, so no geometric altitude was available for comparison. For the final 5 minutes of flight, the helicopter was flying over the tidal portion of the Potomac River, so the radio altitude would be equal to the height above sea level. Additionally, later testing of similar helicopters, which will be discussed next, showed good agreement between geometric and radio altitudes while over the river, adding an additional level of confidence to the radio altitude's accuracy. While the radio altitudes of the CRJ and the helicopter, which are shown as red lines, were within 10 feet at the approximate time of impact, the helicopter corrected pressure altitude was 100 feet lower than the CRJ's corrected pressure altitude. This picture shows the instrument panel of a UH-60L. On the right side of the image, the radio altimeter is circled in red, and the barometric altimeter is circled in green. The discrepancies between the radio and pressure altitudes recorded on the accident flight data recorder and questions about what altitude was displayed to the crew based on their altitude callouts led to a series of altimeter tests. 3 UH-60L helicopters from the same battalion as the accident aircraft flew a formation flight where the right seat pilots wore cameras to record the instrument panel. After the flight, the data recorders for each helicopter were downloaded for comparison to the in-cockpit instrumentation videos. This led the lead helicopter was broadcasting to ADSB, so geometric altitude for that aircraft was also recorded. The altimeter testing found that on the ground, before the engines were started, the barometric altimeters of all 3 helicopters were within 20 to 45 feet of the field elevation, which would be considered within tolerance. Once the main rotor was producing enough lift to hover, the barometric altimeter readings dropped significantly and were lower than the helicopter's actual on-the-ground elevation or hover altitude. Notably, the barometric altimeters continued to be 80 to 130 feet lower than the helicopter's determined altitude above sea level when flying at speed over the tidal portion of the Potomac River later in the test. Additionally, the corrected pressure altitude recorded on the data recorders did not match the video captured barometric altimeter readings on the ground for any helicopter, but did show good agreement when flying over the Potomac for 2 of the helicopters. The results of the flight tests led to on-ground tests of the pitot-static systems for each helicopter. For these checks, the pitot-static probes are connected to a test rig that simulates set altitudes by increasing or decreasing the pressure the probes see. The altimeters on 2 of the test helicopters performed well. On the 3rd helicopter, the altimeters still performed within or near the tolerance, but were less accurate. So, while the altimeters showed an 80 to 130 foot differences in flight, they were within 20 to 55 feet under a controlled test environment. A helicopter's rotor system produces the lift and thrust that allows it to fly. The wind that you feel when you are near a helicopter taking off is the downwash produced by the rotor, which changes the air pressure around the fuselage of the helicopter, making it challenging to measure an accurate static pressure to determine altitude. The controlled environment of the pitot-static ground checks eliminated all rotor downwash effects, and those results also matched the flight test altimeter readings that were made before the engines were started. But once the helicopter rotors were turning and producing lift and thrust, the altimeter readings lowered significantly and stayed lower throughout the flights. In summary, we found discrepancies between the FDR pressure altitude and determined height above sea level for the accident helicopter. Subsequent testing showed discrepancies between the cockpit barometric altimeters and the determined height above sea level on 3 other UH-60Ls. The objective of this panel is to learn more about the design of pedostatic systems and the altimeters, the unique challenges in designing such systems for helicopters, and how the accuracy of these systems is determined and maintained. Another objective of this panel is to learn more about how parametric data, particularly from the air data systems, are validated for flight recorders. This concludes our presentation. Mr. Shin will now begin questioning.
For the witnesses for this panel, we'll ask our questions in 3 distinct topic areas: air data system design, pilot operational considerations with the barometric altimeter, and air data accuracy for flight recorders. So we'll start with air data system design. Mr. Cooper, can you please describe some of the engineering considerations on the placement of static ports on a helicopter?
When placing the pedo and static ports on a helicopter, you must first consider the total set of customer requirements, and then consider the complex flow dynamics, as was shown in your presentation, that occur throughout the whole flight operational regime of the aircraft.
And when you say customer requirements, can you expand on that, please? What that could entail?
For example, they have where they're going to operate. So if they have to land in austere conditions, sand, grass fields, have to consider impacts to material entering the probes or damaging the probes. Must consider maintenance operations on the aircraft. If the probes are placed lower, there is risk, of course, to the maintainers bumping in injury as well as damaging the probes. And then another area that needs to be considered: what other sensors are populated on the aircraft? Those sensors have their own needs for placement to meet their performance requirements, and they can create disturbed airflow in themselves in different locations that, of course, would affect that probe location.
And Mr. Cooper, how does the location of the static port affect the cockpit instrument readings during different regimes of helicopter flight, such as hover, cruise, sideways flight, backwards flight?
It's a function of the static position error that exists in those different regimes of flight. So the helicopter has, of course, a wide operational movement, forward, rear, sideward, rearward flight, as well as side slip limits. The static port placement must be able to handle the whole regime, although accuracy is normally presented in forward flight.
And Mr. Cooper, how are the aerodynamic effects of the cockpit instrument readings due to placement of the static ports identified during the design phase for the air data system?
When this aircraft was originally designed in the late 70s, placement was done by experience and general practice. Military helicopters from Sikorsky at that time placed the probes over the cockpit and was generally found to meet the requirements. Of course, today, computational fluid dynamics could be used to analyze, but in the late 70s, that was an opportunity. So the placement is made, and then flight test is utilized to gather the data to identify the resulting error of that placement.
And is there a design target for the amount of difference between indicated altitude and the actual altitude for the helicopter when designing a system?
Can you clarify? please.
So for the difference between what's indicated in the cockpit instrument to where the helicopter is actually at for altitude, is there a target during the design phase that you try to achieve for the placement of the ports for certain airspeeds?
For the UH-60, it would be based on any government requirements.
And what about for commercial helicopters that Sikorsky has designed?
Again, it depends on the category it's being certified. FAR 291325, provides guidance for static position error, as well as it provides wording that you must use a certified altimeter.
Okay. And with the complex flow environments that we've identified that are present with helicopters in designing these systems, can you please describe some of the mitigation strategies that may be used to account for these aerodynamic effects that you see in the indicated altitude?
For the Black Hawk, at the time it was designed and with the government requirements that were provided, really probe geometry, placement, its installation angles is the primary tool. The UH-60 government requirements specified a specific altimeter to utilize. So that would not make the altimeter indication system an option to address any corrections. Present day, of course, with advanced equipment, air data computers give you more of an option. But again, 1970s, late 70s, that was not available, and the government requirements specifically called out the altimeter to be used, and it was provided as government furnished material property.
And Mr. Bradham, how would the Army evaluate mitigation strategies developed by a manufacturer?
Yeah, so typically in flight test, but if I could just back up for 1 second and just to clarify, so for a pedostatic system, we talk about instrument error, which is the actual calibration error in the physical altimeter itself, and that's what you're checking when you check on the ground without the rotors turning. And then you have what is called position error or installation error, which is the error caused by aerodynamic effects around the aircraft. And those are two independent errors with different standards. And I would say the standards that the Army used and the standards that the FAA uses for civil aircraft are very similar, and these issues are not unique to military aircraft. But your question is how would we evaluate that? And you do an airspeed calibration in flight test, and that airspeed calibration determines, for a given flight condition, determines the position error of the pedostatic system, and then we can mathematically convert that into altimeter error, and we can assess that against a standard. So for the Black Hawk, the position error, that standard was a mil spec called mil-I 6115, which has a very similar, slightly more stringent standard than Part 29.
And if a helicopter did not meet that military standard, would there be a required redesign, or would there be a correction factor that gets applied that pilots have to utilize? This question is to Mr. Bradham.
Yes, I think that would depend very much on the specific circumstances. There were, looking back through the historical documents, there were cases where there were small out of spec issues. One not over a standard in one place, and the decision is made, by the government and the contractor that there's no further action required there. They can provide a correction to the operator when that's necessary, but again, I think it would depend on the particular flight condition and the particular size of and the effect of the noncompliance.
Mr. Cooper, for the UH-60L helicopter, the pedostatic probes are placed above the cockpit, which is closer in proximity to the main rotor. What are the technical considerations that would lead for those pedostatic probes to be placed closer to the main rotor?
in line what I stated before. It's a balance of the total set of requirements. So again, for a military utility helicopter operating in the landing conditions it does. Placement of the probes lower, as I said, could expose it to ingress of material, danger to maintainers, damage during ground operations. So that would tend to give guidance, provide an alternative by putting it above the cockpit, as was done on other military models Sikorsky and others produced at that time.
And Mr. Gant, can you describe how the FAA approaches certification of static systems and barometric altimeters on civil helicopters?
Yeah, so as mentioned previously, for altimeters in civil transport category helicopters, that is regulated by Federal Aviation Regulation 29.1325 for altimeters. And the expectation is that the applicant for certification would comply with all the requirements within that paragraph, including the position air requirements that are in there. There are allowable tolerances.
And from the FAA's perspective, would there be a concern with the placement of the pitot-static probes as seen on the Black Hawk?
I don't have any opinion on that. I think there's different ways to design, just as you've shown in your presentation. Maybe typical today is more on static port locations on the fuselage, but there have been many instances where static ports are also co-located with the pitot system. So again, it comes down with compliance to the requirements and not necessarily the aspects of whether that's incorporated one way or the other.
And Mr. Cooper, aside from customer requirements, what would be other technical considerations to select a pitot-static probe versus a pitot probe with a separate static port that's on the fuselage?
Again, I sorry to come back to it, but it is the total set of requirements. In that picture you showed for the fuselage placement, that was a Naval Hawk aircraft, a Sikorsky produced Naval Hawk aircraft, but it does not have a requirement for a sliding cabin, or also known as the gunner's window. So that area would be covered when the gunner's window is in the open position, as it can be in flight. So that would take that location, that example you've shown. It comes down to available real estate, the dynamic conditions in that area. In your discussions with me earlier, you mentioned tail ports, static ports, but again, there's equipment on the Black Hawk that would impact that operation. It's considering all the requirements that the helicopter must meet, what's fitted to achieve that, and what available area on the fuselage can be utilized, and then with that, understanding the dynamic conditions that may be present on that fuselage if it's static, if it's suitable for a static port.
And Mr. Bradham, aside from the static 1 and static 2 systems on the Black Hawk, are there alternate static sources?
No, not on the Black Hawk. The S1 and S2 are redundant, and each static system, as you mentioned in your presentation, pulls from each side's pitot tube. So S1's fed from both right and left, and S2's fed from both right and left.
Okay. Can you please, Mr. Cooper, this question's for you. Can you please describe the types of errors that can add up to ultimately affect the indicated altitude on the barometric altimeter?
As was stated by the other gentleman, there's two prime areas. One of them has several contributions, but there's the static source error, and then there is the instrument error. The instrument error for this altimeter has several factors that builds up to its estimated error. Instrument error, consider a tolerance. There's a plus and minus. So when you come up with that error, there could be in the plus direction or the minus. Static source error, which is identified, the resulting is identified during flight test. It's usually a number as a function of airspeed, and it is not constant, but I would not call it tolerance. There's not a plus or minus. There is a number that's identified during flight test as a function of airspeed.
Mr. Bradham, from the airworthiness perspective, how are the stack up of these errors managed by the Army?
So for the, from an airworthiness perspective, right, we have standards for each of the individual errors as they occur. So instrument error, so for the altimeter itself was handled for the Blackhawk by mil spec. It was a mil spec, it was 81852 and 81851, and that lays out a number of individual tests under specific conditions for a number of specific errors. So for example, inside the altimeter, there's two separate calibration tests, one for the Colesman window gearing and one for the expanding aneroid capsules. And there's different standards for those, and those are independent errors. So we don't have a standard to roll all that together. We do it by each individual error that occurs to make sure it meets tolerance. And I believe that's how it's done, not just in the Army. But then you have position error, and as I said, that's a mil spec 6115 alpha, which has a standard for that. So and then, yeah, so that's how we manage it. Each one of the errors has its own tolerance defined, and there's corresponding civil standards. The FAA has a TSO, a technical standard order, that defines altimeter instrument error, and FAR Part 29 talks about altimeter position error, same as the mil specs used to.
Mr. Cooper, can you tell me about other designs for barometric altimeters? In this case, the accident helicopter's barometric altimeters uses aneroid wafers or capsules, as Mr. Bradham mentioned. Can you tell me more about other designs that ultimately allow for higher precision and accuracy for barometric altitude or pressure altitude?
So first, the time period, that was a common design. And as I said, the government requirements, that altimeter was specified to be used and was provided by the government. As time has gone on, and certainly current day, air data computers became available, which provided they did not have the mechanical wafers, the mechanical indicating dial. They did not have the mechanical correction for the Colesman window. So those errors could come out. So the implementation of air data computer, which requires a different display medium, allows you to achieve a lower error at the instrument error analogy.
And Mr. Bradham, what are the factors that are considered in transitioning existing helicopters to newer technologies such that Mr. Cooper just talked about?
From an airworthiness perspective, we're just looking to see if it meets all the standard requirements. I would say that, the Army and DoD, we've moved away from the very prescriptive mil specs, and we use commercial standards more typically going forward.
And Mr. Gant, from the civil helicopter side, at what point do the design requirements warrant transition to newer technologies that we're talking about here with air data computers?
Well, we don't prescribe when a new technology has to be introduced unless it's one that we think would improve safety to the extent that we would go through the whole process of rulemaking to make that technology available, or a requirement, excuse me, in the federal regulations.
And Mr. Gant, with changing operational requirements in the national airspace key into that decision of whether rulemaking is needed to require newer technologies?
I would say it could factor into that.
And this question is for both Mr. Cooper and Mr. Bradham. Aside from rotor wash considerations, what other challenges are there in designing an air data system that provides accurate indicated altitude to the pilots?
I go from my perspective, the main issue is low speed operation, right? And that's the influence of the rotor wake, which is what you talked about, right? It's why you see, when an aircraft picks up to a hover, why you see the altimeter decrease, right? It's the rotor wake coming down on the static system, and that's at low speeds, common to helicopters, that can be an issue. It's why the Black Hawk pressure instruments, really below 40 knots aren't used. So I think that's the primary issue, but the configuration of the aircraft can affect the static position error.
Yeah, for low speed, it is obviously the rotor wash, but at more forward speeds, that rotor wash is not impinging on the probe, so that is not a factor at the higher speeds. Certainly above 60 knots normally is where we don't see that effect. Again, depends on the install, but it is the configuration of the aircraft, what else is installed, either originally or